in the beginning, Genesis chapter 1 through 3. We're going to talk today about the creation in Adam and Eve. Realize that Moses tries to explain to the Israelites how things got started, right? And before the beginning, nothing existed. We have an idea of what nothing means, but we can't really conceptualize that in our brains because we are so physical in this world. But at one point in time, there was nothing. Nothing existed. It's so hard to comprehend. And out of nothingness, we hear God, and he speaks. God speaks. What does he say? What's the 3 words that he says? 4 words. No, 3 words. No, 4 words. 4 words. What did he say? Let there be light. God started by creating light. And then a few other things happened, of course, and here we are today. Could Moses have provided the Israelites with the math that light really is? In other words, there is a formula here I'm looking at is C equals X times F. It's a pretty simple little formula, right? But C is the speed of light. Did Moses know the speed of light? And if he even tried to explain that to the children, they'd say, light has a speed to it? What are you talking about? It comes and it goes away. Light travels about 300,000 kilometers a second or 200,000 miles per second. 200,000 miles a second. X is the wavelength of light, but it's an angstrom. So you have to understand angstroms to be able to understand that. And then F is the frequency of the light waves as they travel. In other words, how fast are they moving in waves? Do you think Moses could have given that to the children of Israel? They would not have understood at all what you're talking about. You're talking some language that we don't understand. And it really is the language of math. But Moses goes on then and explains it in a way the children of Israel can understand it. 6 days, God worked. And during that 6-day work period, he created the earth. He created air and water and land and plants, the stars, the sun, the moon, the fish, the bird, the land, and finally man. That's pretty much what he told them. If you read that first chapter, that's pretty much the way it is in there. Here's a question for you. God did all of this over 6 days because then on the 7th day, he rested. A day in English doesn't have one meaning. It doesn't always mean 24 hours a day, does it? Think about the other times you hear vague time, like days like that are defined, like my birthday. To me, that is a day. That was a day that I was born. Didn't take the whole day, thankfully, for my mother, but it took a while of that day, and I was born. New Year's Day, Valentine's Day, and so forth. Those are specific days. But there is a, hold on just one more minute, one more thing to do here. I am totally without my notes today, so I am having to wing it. Oh, you're not seeing what I'm seeing, are you? Good grief. A day doesn't always have a 24-hour meaning. There's Valentine's Day when you think about that, holidays and so forth, and other ways that we use that term. But day is a relative term. It's relative specifically to the earth because the moon has a day that is 656 days long. It revolves just like the earth does, and every 656 days it comes back around to where it was. It doesn't take, that's days. It takes that many days for it to get around here. In our case, it takes 24 hours to get around to form a day, right? But on Mars, it takes 24 hours. On Jupiter, it takes 10 hours. And on Saturn and Uranus, it only takes 16 hours. So it's relative specifically to this earth. That day just doesn't have a meaning that means 24 hours all the time. Evening and morning is sometimes used in the Bible to describe a day, but evenings and mornings don't have the same length as you go along through the year because of the seasons and everything. In Exodus chapter 20, verse 1, it says, "In 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth and all that's in it, and then he did what on the 7th day? He rested." Do you think God rested for 24-hour earth days? Could a day in Genesis mean a longer period of time? And this is where some of us kind of get hung up. We really want to say that Moses said a day, and a day means 24 hours, And that's what God intended for us to understand. I'm asking your indulgence to think that it's possible that it means more than 24 hours. The creation account is interesting because we know what was created, and we teach our children what was created on days 1 through 6. On day 1, God created light and dark. On day 2, he created the sky. On day 3, he created dry land, plants, and seas. On day 4, he created stars and moon and sun. On day 5, he created flying animals and swimming animals. And then on 6, he created land animals and all the things that exist on land. And also, he created people. Read through that and understand that he created people at the very end of this, right? So that was what God did. On days 1 and day 2, he created a firmament, separated the waters. You know, when I was in this high and I was at church, I had a guy actually teach us that there is a vault up there that separates the earth from the rain and everything else that's up there. All of the rain and everything come down on us from up there. Honestly, he told us that. It took me forever to wipe that out of my head, but that's the way the Bible describes it, because he separated the waters from those above and those below. And that was what the children of Israel could understand too, right? They were just like me in the first grade or second grade. God made the firmament, divided the waters. It goes on. On day 3, he created dry land, and he created plants and seeds. And on day 4, he created stars and the moon and the sun. He did all of that. But didn't we just say, God said, let there be light? He said that before there was anything, right? And light was the first thing that was created. Yet it says here on day 4, he created light. Now that's confusing if you think about it. He created it, but it's not available to us until day 4. Is that the ideal? Hang on to that and we'll talk about it. On day 5, he created birds and water animals. And then he created land animals on day 6. And then at the very end of day 6, in his wisdom, he created man and woman. He created man and woman and put them on the earth. Then what did he do on day 7? He did what you and I do sometimes. I do in the evenings a lot. Afternoons, I take a nap. And God took a nap. He rested. And I'm guessing the ones that want to hang on to a 24-hour period, if you're there, I don't mean to offend you, but did God really rest for only 24 hours? We don't know how long he rested, but he created for us a complete day in which we are supposed to rest. And we very seldom ever do. So the question is, has there ever, for me and you then, for the rest of the people that lived on this earth, been a day when a day was longer than a 24-hour period? Can you think of anything in the Bible where that happened? Joshua was fighting a tremendous battle with the Amorites, and he wasn't winning. He was going through, he could sense he was going to win, but it was going to take a lot longer than a day. And normally the way they fought was they would fight during the daytime, retreat, get healed up and everything, come back the next day and fight. But he needed a longer day to fight these Amorites, and so he prayed to God and asked for God to let the sun stand still. And the sun stood still. Hezekiah, what did he want? He wanted proof that God was going to do for him what he said he would do, and so he said, God, make that sun go backwards. And that sun did trace its steps. It went back on the dial instead of going forwards as it should normally do. Now, these events seem to imply geocentrism, right? Geocentrism is where the earth stands still and the sun and stars move around the earth, or perhaps some sort of refraction, perhaps, of the sun's light. But it's possible that a day could be longer than that. Christians are divided on it. A day is a literal 24-hour period, or a day could be longer than 24-hour periods. In fact, and what I'm going to ask your indulgence on to understand is, I believe a day, in Moses' terms, was an eon. It was thousands, hundreds of thousands of years in some cases. A day would be 100,000 years if you can just extend your thinking a little bit to understand what I'm saying. Science will tell you the earth was created, they can date it back about 4.6 billion years ago. But the Bible says it was created in 7 days, and we don't know how long ago it was created. All I want to do today is to consider not that whole issue about how long and everything, but just look at the order of things of which they were created in the Bible and what science will tell you. what your children and grandchildren are learning in school today about the order of things that were created. Because science has broken it down into 6 periods. We've broken it down in the Bible. We have it broken down for us into 6 days. But if you compare just the order, you might be surprised. How many work periods were they? Of course, God worked for 6 days, and then on the 7th day, he rested. Well, science has broken it down into 6 eons, or 6 periods. The Hadean, Archean, Proterozoic, Paleozoic, Mesozoic, and Cenozoic periods. There are 6 of them. And your children are going to learn this when they go at some point in time into physical science. They will learn this pretty quickly. What happened in science on day 1? Well, if you look at what the Bible says about how everything was dark and formless, that's pretty much what science says the earth looked like when it was first created. There really, if you go back far enough, there really wasn't a sun and a moon. There was nothing for us to look at there. When he created everything, the earth got created with it, and it would have been a very, very, very dark place here. There just really was no light around for that to happen. The sky is dark with haze, and you're not even able to, if anybody had been here on day 1 or the Hadean period, you would not have been able to look up and see anything because it would have been nothing but a dark fog, misty fog all around you. You couldn't look up even and see the sky. And there's a reason for that we'll talk about in just a minute. But on day 1, and in the Hadean period, the earth gets created, and then on day 1, just like it says in the Bible. So there's no real difference between what the Bible says and what science is saying about day 1. Period 2 is the Archean period, and the Archean period was a period of geologic activity where all the continents were not in the configuration that we recognize. South America, North America, Europe, those are not there. Things are just completely different. If you looked at all of the plates, tectonic plates that are around, those were completely different. The earth was being bombarded with comets and asteroids. Liquid water is being present, but there are just simple single-cell organisms that existed according to what science says. And the Archean period lasts for 1.3 billion years. That would be what the Bible would say is day 2. On day 3 then, things start happening. Multi-cell life forms appear according to science. Vegetation. Vegetation begins to spring up everywhere. And the Proterozoic period lasts for 2 billion years. It's the longest of all of them, lasting longer than any of the others. What's happening during that period of time is the earth is cooling. Temperatures have come down to the temperature that they are today. It's like a hothouse here, though. It's a hothouse here on the earth, a great place for vegetation to come up. What does vegetation produce that's useful for us? Besides the fact we can eat it and get sustenance from it, what does it put back out into the atmosphere? Oxygen. It puts oxygen into the air. All of these plants that have come on board are beginning to put oxygen up in the air. What does that do to the skies and that fog that we talked about earlier? It gets rid of it, right? If you were here on this day, then you could see a blue sky just like we do. You could look up and see the heavens at night and see the stars and things that might be in place at that point in time. That's day 3. Then on day 4, the Paleozoic period, this is where it really begins to get bright and light. And in addition to all of the plants, animals start coming on the scene. In day 4, it's the Paleozoic period. The fish populations explode. The Bible says things in the sea first. The fish populations explode, and on the earth, plants and conifer trees, invertebrates, land vertebrates appear. Then some large reptiles appear. And at one point in time, there's a Permian extinction. During this period, day 4, there was a Permian extinction that killed 90% of everything that started. So for a while, we were going strong. And then you run into this extinction period, and it kills 90% of everything and starts all over again. It killed 70% of all the land animals, plants, and insects. The Paleozoic period then lasts for about 500 million years. That's a long number of years, isn't it? A lot of birthdays in that. Then you come to what we call day 5. Day 5 is where God created the flying animals and the sea creatures. In science terminology, it's called the Mesozoic period. You've heard of that, right? The Mesozoic period. Well, during the Mesozoic period, according to science, the plates began to shift to the continents. If we were to look at it from the sky down on the earth, we would recognize North America and South America. Basically, we'd recognize the continents as they are today. And it's during this period that the mammals and birds first appear. The climate was very warm, and all of the smaller reptiles and mammals appeared, and it ended again with another one of those extinction events. I told you the 90% one that happened earlier, it happened again right here. So we had to start all over again with these creatures that came about, because it went down to about 10% of the ones that were living made it through it. The others just died out. That period lasted for about 200 million years. Of all things, the Mesozoic period is one of the smaller periods, but it only lasted 200 million years. But during that time, all the ones that died began to come back. And then on day 6, it's the Cenozoic period. You know what was created during the Cenozoic period according to science? Well, Genesis said, "Let the land produce living creatures, livestock, creatures that move along the ground, wild animals." And finally, in Genesis 1:26, at the very end of the first day, God created man and woman. Believe it or not, I'm looking at a clock here that defines when things were formed. And there is a period in the Cenozoic period, that's the period we're in today. And at the very end of the Cenozoic period, where we are today, it hadn't ended yet, thankfully, but it will at some point in time. At the very end of what we understand to be the Cenozoic period, man comes on the scene. If this were a clock, man would have been on the scene only minutes, in terms of the whole time that the earth has existed and all of this stuff was creating. And science even tells you that man would have only been here for a few minutes. That would have been the Cenozoic period. It lasts for about, so far, 65 million years, and that's the period that we're in. And that is the period, of course, that man was created. And then on day 7, it's said that God took a rest. Well, we're at the end of the Cenozoic period. I mean, today it's still going on. Tomorrow it will still be here. But sometime during that point in time, God took a time for some rest. On the 7th day, he rested from all of his work. So I guess what I'm trying to convince you of is this. If you look at what science is telling your children and your grandchildren, it's telling them exactly what the Bible tells you in terms of when things were created. The Bible puts it in 6 days. Science puts it in an untold number of millions of years. But the goodness behind this to me is science and the Bible is pretty much in lockstep on when things and how things were created. We only have a small view of that. That's one chapter in a book Moses wrote many millions of years ago. And we don't know we can't really, he couldn't have expressed it the way that science can express it today. And who knows what it's going to look like in the future with our understanding if we continue to grow. But at least it gives me confidence that when my children come home to me and say, you know, they're teaching evolution, they're teaching all this stuff about when things were created, and it doesn't seem to jive with the Bible, you can say, well, let's just look at the first chapter and make sure you understand. Your science teacher is telling you exactly what the Bible tells you in terms of what was created when. Does that not give you some confidence maybe in this Bible that we're reading? It gives you a different way to look at Genesis. For me it did anyway, and it gave me some confidence that I just didn't have before. And I wish I had had this when my children were little and they came to me with all of those questions that I just don't have the answer for. But I am convinced that it's important that we get this message in the hands of the parents of our children, and we get this message in front of our children as well. I'd love to do this class, this particular class right here for our children who are in the 6th, 7th, and 8th grades, to have them understand that I think you can reconcile the Bible and you can reconcile science. You just have to release yourself from a couple of typical church ideas about how long a day is. If you can somehow give on that, you can say that science and the Bible are saying almost exactly the same thing. The first thing that was created was light. Science tells you the first thing that was created was light. And it's just amazing to me that there is the synergy that I never knew existed. So the order of creation, what was created, is in line with science according to the Bible. It gives me great credence now in what Moses told us. Well, you come to this story about the Garden of Eden, right? How do you deal with that? The Garden of Eden, the first man and woman. Deal with it as you want to, but we understand the Garden of Eden. It was a garden of all kinds of trees. It was in the east somewhere, in a place called Eden. Possibly we think that somewhere over in the Fertile Crescent. It mentions rivers, and some of the names of the rivers go back, and some of the rivers that are over there in Persia and that area are the same names that you're reading about in the Bible. So maybe we think it was over there somewhere. The Tigris and the Euphrates River, for instance. And God formed man from the dust of the earth. And he breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living being. Put him in the garden, right? And he had a huge garden to tend to. Well, if I was sent out to work in the garden, I'd get tired and I'd want some help too. I'd want my sisters and brothers to come with me, but he was it. He was the only one. So he came to God and complained a little bit. I don't have brothers and sisters. I don't have children that can help me in this garden. Help me out here, God. And God said, okay, let me put you to sleep. And when you wake up, you're going to have a partner. You'll have a partner. Eve was created, of course, bone of my bones, flesh of my flesh, and Adam named her woman. And both of them were naked and they felt no shame. You may not know this, but everything that has life in it today, every living creature that's out there has a set of chromosomes. And I believe there are 26. I could have told you that if I could look at my notes, but I can't see them. There are 23 pairs of chromosomes. And it's fortunate that all of us are not the same way. Men were created with an X and a Y chromosome, but all the rest of the pairs of chromosomes we have are XX pairs. But there's one pair in us that's different from women, because in that women, on the women's pair, it's XX. In other words, there are two X's that came together. It's a full strand. In our case, it's a strand and a half. It's an XY chromosome. So that's the only thing that makes men and women different. So you can go home now and tell if the wives, you could go home and tell your husbands that they are imperfect because they only have 22 perfect pairs, and that 23rd pair, you're at an XY. I'm perfect. You're not. You know, that's the whole idea behind it. But every living creature has that configuration, XX for males, XY for females, in one set of pairs of chromosomes. God gave them a command, told them don't eat of any fruit. And I think God was really testing their comprehension, testing their intelligence and their compliance. In other words, did they really understand me? Are they smart enough to understand me? And will they do what I tell them to do? He was testing all of that. And the serpent came to God and said, came to Eve and said, did God really say don't eat of everything? And Eve said, well, no, there's only one tree. That tree over there, Eve, that is the most beautiful tree, and look at the fruit. Isn't it nice? And he just enticed her, and she went over there and ate some of the fruit, brought it to her husband, and he ate of it. And we know that story. So I want you to compare Christ at some point in time. We won't do it today, but just compare the temptations of Christ with the temptations of Eve, and they're exactly the same three that Eve was challenged with. That is an interesting comparison, if you will. So they hid from God. God sent them away from the paradise. And there's one word I want you to take from this today. It is a Greek word. It is proto-evangelium. Say it with me, proto-evangelium. I want you to remember that word because that means the first gospel sermon. Proto is first. The first gospel sermon is Genesis 1, chapter 1. God said, let there be light. And at the end of the chapter, all of his creation is there. So he will crush Satan and put him under your feet in Romans. That's the way we understand it. And that is exactly what happened in Genesis chapter 1. All right, I think the other classes are letting out. You guys will be mad at me if I keep you a minute longer. So thank you very much. And we'll pick up there and start digging into the chapters of Genesis next week.